La caída.
The downfall. Zelensky is literally between a rock and a hard place. He either goes along with the peace plan proposed by President Trump, essentially an outright surrender, or the United States completely withdraws its military support for Ukraine. To top it off, Trump set next Thursday as the deadline for Zelensky to respond. How will the Ukrainian president react in this situation? The end is in sight. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning from Berlin, Germany.
Muy buenos días desde Berlín, Alemania. Comenzamos la transmisión 294.
We're starting broadcast number 294 of Demolishing Myths Talks, live from Berlin. Thank you very much for joining us. And please remember to help us out with a thumbs up against censorship, with your comments, and by subscribing. And if you'd like to support us through memberships or our PayPal account, your help is, of course, also very welcome. On the other side of the screen, and on the other side of the cold, icy European continent right now, from Madrid, Spain, we're joined by Mr. Fernando Moragón. Fernando, how's everything over there?
Fernando Moragón. Fernando, ¿qué tal todo por ahí?
Bueno, efectivamente, ya hace fresquete y tal, menos que en Ucrania.
Well, yes, it's getting chilly and all, though not as much as in Ukraine, where they're going to have a very harsh winter. But here we have heating, there they don't. But that said, right, I just realized episode 234, no, 94, we'll have to do something special for number 300, I'd say. Some kind of celebration, you know, a special episode or something. We'll have to do something, which of course we're not going to reveal, because otherwise it wouldn't be any fun. But something must be done. And that said, yes, indeed, now we move on to our friend Zelensky, who's very depressed and seems to be at the end of his rope. Well, there's already movement within the core. Let's say that in the power core in Ukraine, you have Zelensky's people. And then there's the opposition, let's say, but the internal opposition, not the external opposition to the regime, because that doesn't exist anymore. They've wiped it out. All of Poroshenko's people, Timoshenko's people, all of them, and so on, are conspiring to get rid of Zelensky in an open way now. But anyway, we'll talk about all that later. What we already have is that, really, we were talking on Wednesday, not 5 years ago, no, last Wednesday, and the Russian advances are moving at an incredible speed, especially in the south. I mean, if they keep going at this pace, by the end of winter, almost all of Zaporizhia will have fallen, and a good part of Dnipropetrovsk too. They might even be besieging or have taken Pavlograd in Dnipropetrovsk. Anyway, we'll talk about it now. But we can even make a forecast by tracing the future front line at the end of this winter, meaning next year. But just to add one more thing, von der Leyen, that wonderful lady Ezekiel and I like so much, said she sent some letters to Europeans the other day, telling them that the Ukrainians can't hold on, that all this will be over by 2026. In other words, they're desperate. They've held some conclaves and come up with a series of points they want to negotiate with Trump. We'll talk about that in a moment. But really, if they try to negotiate any of those points, Trump will send them, well, not just packing, but even further.
Fernando, how about we start the analysis with Zelensky's own words, describing this situation in a speech addressed to the Ukrainian people? Apparently, these are his words from yesterday. By the way, Fernando, one question. What's the temperature in Madrid right now?
Una pregunta, ¿cuál es la temperatura ahora en Madrid? Solo como contexto.
Hoy debe estar.
Just for context. Right now, today, it shouldn't be very cold, with a high of around 14 degrees, maybe 12 or 13 at most.
Una sensación térmica no muy fría, o sea, no.
Ok, porque el otro día, 8 acá según.
Well, yes, but with that wind chill, I wouldn't get cold. I mean, no. Okay, because the other day, 8 here, according to the weather service, 8 degrees now in Madrid. Well, here in Germany right now, 3 degrees below zero, but with a wind chill of -8. In Ukraine, probably colder than that, and without heating. I'm emphasizing this, Fernando, because for a good part of our audience, the demolishers from Latin America, used to the mild temperatures of our beautiful lands, they might not be aware of what winter means in Europe, and above all, in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, and Northern Europe. A winter without heating can easily mean the death of a person. Just like that, plain and simple.
Así de sencillo, por hipotermia, sin más.
De hecho, se mueren.
In fact, they die, and you don't have to go to Norway or Sweden. Here in Madrid, people who don't have a home, the homeless and so on, every year there are cases of deaths in January from the cold. And that's even though it doesn't get very cold here. By the way, I don't know if you can check what the temperature is today in Kyiv, for example.
No sé si puedes mirar qué temperatura tienen, por ejemplo, hoy en Kiev.
We can see it immediately.
Esto puede ser muy interesante.
This could be very interesting. I was doing a Zelensky with my nose.
This is a Zelensky, doing this with the nose. Right now the temperature is 4 degrees, but the wind chill is much lower than that. At the moment, the wind chill is -1 degree. By the way, regarding Fernando's comment, here in Berlin, farther north and with a much colder climate, many homeless people die every winter. Because of that, the city of Berlin creates what they call heat stations in the subway stations, so that some of them stay open all night for people living on the streets to spend the night and not die from hypothermia.
Y que la noche no determine la muerte por hipotermia. Además, unas camionetitas.
In addition, some small vans drive around the city at night. They call them the heat bus, something like that. Let's see, bus in German. The heat bus or the warm bus. Those little vans are basically parked in plazas, in places where homeless people, vagrants, and others gather. Well, they park them there, set them up, and call people over so that, at the very least, they can take a break from the cold night, with the heating turned up high inside, as a survival measure. Just to give a bit of context. And now, Fernando, let's begin with Zelensky's own words, with this context of winter still looming, but with the situation in Ukraine already, in this sense, desperate.
Ukraine.
Sorry, this is the untranslated version. I'm here with the same video, but translated.
Sí, porque mi ucraniano es malo.
El mío también.
Один з найважчих моментів нашої історії. Зараз тиск на Україну один.
Very well. Yes, please. Mine too. Clearer, quite clear.
Bastante clarito. O acompañan o convalidan el plan.
Either they support or endorse Zelensky's 28-point peace plan, which basically meets almost all of Russia's conditions, except in Kherson and Zaporizhzhia, or the United States abandons them and the war begins, in which they are already retreating more and more against Russia, without the crucial support of the United States.
Contra Rusia sin el apoyo fundamental de Estados Unidos.
Pero fíjate lo que dice. Dice dos cosas básicamente.
But look at what he says. He basically says two things. That we have to choose between dignity and losing a key partner. The United States, obviously, is not Andorra, I'm telling you. It's not Andorra. Fine, the United States, because indeed, without the US, the war wouldn't last even 3 days. Not in winter or in summer. I mean, without American intelligence, they wouldn't be able to do absolutely anything. Fine, he says that to add some drama to the matter, but what does he tell us in the end? Look at what he says, more or less. He says, well, dignity matters and all that, and we can't trust someone who has invaded us 2 or 3 times. Deep down, he's telling you he's going to say no.
Que va a decir que no. Es decir, no puede salir diciendo, y vamos a decir.
That is, he can't just come out and say, and we're going to say no, come on. But deep down, what he's really implying is that he's going to say no, because he can't accept it. Let's be clear about one thing. You know that the thesis I've been defending from the start is that all of this is a charade. A more or less agreed upon charade, more or less not completely, between Trump and Putin, or between Russia and the United States. Why? Because the Americans want to reestablish economic relations with the Russians. Why? Because the Russians are good, beautiful, and wonderful? No. Because the Russians have a lot of things the Americans absolutely and completely need if they want to try to defeat the Chinese, starting with rare earths. Let's not forget that Russia, which has them almost untouched, is the fourth largest producer of rare earths in the world. The Chinese come first by a huge, enormous margin. Then comes Vietnam, if I remember correctly, then Australia, and then Russia. In other words, they really have them, which means they need them just as they need their gas and oil. Even though they're now independent in gas, as you know, all the studies on hydraulic fracturing are saying that in the next decade the fracking boom will be over. That's it. So later they'll also need gas and of course oil. Because let's not forget, the United States keeps buying oil from all over the world because it has a deficit in oil. It's not independent. That's why they want to take over Venezuela and Canada and so on. Well, they need it. They want to reestablish economic relations, and they have a big problem in the middle, Ukraine. We've seen, ever since Trump began his second term, a bunch of staged shows with Putin, calls and all that, getting angry, then reconciling, meetings they've arranged between Russians and Ukrainians in Istanbul, the first, the second, the third, then meeting in Alaska, then doing who knows what, sending tomahawks to the Ukrainians, then not sending them. It's all theater, just a show to waste time, wasting time for the Ukrainians and for the Europeans, but buying time for Trump and for Putin, for different reasons. Why? Because what Trump wants is for Putin, once and for all, to finish the job and defeat the Ukrainians. That way, it becomes a policy of fates accompli. He can then go and tell the Democrats, who are the warmongers in the United States, the non-Trumpist Republicans like Lindsey Graham, who are also warmongers, and the Europeans, not to mention the Ukrainians. No, look, the Russians have already won, and there's nothing more to be done here. There's no option to support Ukraine or anything else because they've lost. That's what he wants. So what has he done now? Again, what has he done? He's put forward a so-called peace plan, if you can call it that, those 28 points. What's the purpose of it? To achieve a peace plan, a negotiated agreement between Russians and Ukrainians? No, ladies and gentlemen, no. This is done so that Ukrainians and Europeans are forced to reject it. It's not made to be accepted, it's made to be rejected. And that legitimizes Trump to be able to say, well then go your own way, do whatever you want, I'm done with you. Because if you read it, the 28 points are unacceptable for Zelensky, for the Europeans, especially for Zelensky and the Ukrainians. But in those 28 points, they even talk about denazification. How are the Nazis going to accept denazification? They can't. That is to say, as I said, this is made so that Ukraine has to say no. And from there, Mr. Trump washes his hands of it. He says, gentlemen, Europeans, this is your business. The Europeans are scared to death because they don't have a penny left. Sorry, a euro. That is, let's see if they stop stealing. Well, they've already done the stealing. I mean, let's see if they go after the famous Russian central bank funds, which are mainly in Belgium, in Euroclear, and so on, because there's no way to get money from where there isn't any. We're in debt, and well, let's see if they can pull off some kind of scheme. And Trump knows this, meaning they've got nothing left to give. So this plan was made, let's be clear about it, so that Mr. Zelensky has no choice but to say no. Let's not forget one thing. Zelensky depends on the war.
No olvidemos una cosa, Zelensky depende de la guerra. Su supervivencia política y física.
His political and physical survival depends on remaining the wartime president forever. The more years, the better. He can't accept it. It would mean, let's not forget, another thing mentioned in those 28 Trump points is that there have to be elections. Let's see, for Zelensky, that's like, get behind me, Satan. In other words, they're not going to accept it. I'm telling you, it's designed so they won't accept it. So this is Trump's strategy, because then people go on TV and say nonsense about how they're going to negotiate, how we're closer to peace or farther away. No, that's not what this is about. They just don't get it. That is to say, that's not what this is about. Trump, from the very beginning, couldn't care less about Ukraine. He has other interests. And one of the things he wants to do is wrap up the Ukraine issue so he can fully focus on the Chinese, since he already has plenty of problems with them after they hit him hard over the rare earths issue. So, what we're going to see, and I'm saying this in advance, is that in the end, well, now that, without any more pretense, because Putin has already said it, and he's very skillful at this, he said it in a very diplomatic way and all that, if we accept, if you notice all the proposals Trump has made to the Russians, what have the Russians always said? No, we welcome the proposals, they're great, but well, in principle we agree, but they need to be studied.
Estamos de acuerdo, pero hay que estudiarlas. Esto es lo que han dicho siempre.
This is what they've always said. What are they going to do now? They've already said it again. Putin, no, this is all very good and so on, very interesting, but of course we need to study them. We need to go into detail. Going into detail, as the Washington Post said the other day, could take a year of negotiations. In a year, the Russians will have already won. In other words, it's over. That's why I say this is all for show now. On Wednesday, they say Trump is going to issue an ultimatum and so on. And then what are the Ukrainians going to say? Well, yes, but no. In an ambiguous way. With the Europeans, wait, with the Europeans. By the way, I don't know if you have that for the end. Macron's famous explanation of the war in Ukraine with the map. I find that explanation fascinating. Well, so here, yes, exactly.
Sí, efectivamente. No sabe qué verdad.
You don't know in what truth. Fernando, beyond Trump's ultimate goal with this peace plan, even if he's not seeking Zelensky's acceptance of the plan, but rather trying to create the conditions for an honorable exit for the United States, this, regardless of his objective, this plan, at this moment marked by the corruption scandal against Zelensky, the growing setbacks on the battlefield, the disaster in the rear caused by Russian attacks on critical infrastructure. All of this creates for Ukraine, and particularly for Zelensky, a situation that's practically inescapable. Because even if he rejects it, with whom is he going to continue the rest of the war against Russia?
With the Europeans.
With the Europeans, what a joke.
Pero fíjate como todo esto no es casualidad.
But look, since none of this is a coincidence, the big corruption scandal in Ukraine breaks out, implicating Zelensky. And the two, I never remember their names, the two anti-corruption organizations, one NABU and the other, who knows. But anyway, both organizations were created by the United States. Created, you know, and they're completely controlled by the United States. Up until this year, until the first big scandal forced Zelensky to try to change the law to strip these two organizations of their powers and authority, they hadn't done absolutely anything. In the country of corruption par excellence, they hadn't done anything for years. I mean, what a coincidence. What a coincidence. That boom, that comes out, and now this comes out. Zelensky gets caught up in it. Come on, it's textbook. It's a US operation to pressure him politically. And now they're launching the second move, the second attack. And now they give you conditions you can't accept.
se lavan las manos.
And what you were saying, they shook hands. Zelensky was aware of this, and that's why the attempt, months ago, you'll remember it, Zelensky's attempt to take control of these organizations. And immediately these organizations reacted, along with the NGOs funded by the United States, and protests began all over Ukraine in defense of the anti-corruption organizations. At that time, they hadn't made any public revelations of any kind, but the wiretapping of Zelensky, his ministers, and all that had already begun, in order to build a case and present it at the right moment. And faced with those protests, very similar to the Maidan ones, only on a smaller scale, Zelensky had to backtrack, once again giving up control of these agencies to the United States. And now the United States presents it at just the right time.
Of course, this is no coincidence. I mean, as you rightly point out, those demonstrations of young men and women, what a coincidence. That with all the searching and recruiting going on by the Ukrainian recruiters, they didn't show up there. And there were plenty of them. They didn't show up. Well, isn't that something? Anyway, the thing is, that was financed, organized, and prepared. It was a color revolution, a warning shot from the United States. And what a coincidence that at that moment the United States and even the Europeans start saying, oh, there's so much corruption, this can't be, this is undemocratic. All powers and capacities must be returned to the anti-corruption organizations. It was laughable when it's known in advance that corruption in Ukraine is absolute and total. Even the janitor at Zelensky's presidential palace is corrupt. But not just them. We also know that Europeans and Americans, especially the Europeans, in all that flow of money that's been going to Ukraine, well, part of it gets lost along the way. And sure, the Ukrainians pocket a lot, but the Europeans and the European Union also pocket some, along the way. Well, let's give them however many billions. Well, I'm left not knowing what to think, if this has even come out. And the Americans, same old story. So of course, everything is more than prepared and schemed. In international relations, coincidence doesn't exist. I mean, this idea that, oh look, unexpected things just happen, that's for natural phenomena, a tsunami, an unpredictable earthquake, but not here. And well, it's clear, we're witnessing the end of Zelensky's regime. We can argue, well, maybe it'll be in January, February, March, whatever, we don't know. But it's the end. It's the final stage. That's clear.
Yes, maybe the only difference, as you just pointed out, Fernando, between corruption in Ukraine before the war and now lies in the amount of money available. If before they took a 20 or 30% commission from corruption in Ukraine, from 100 hryvnias, now they take a 20 or 30% commission from hundreds of billions of dollars. And it's just as Fernando describes it, to the point that even the Americans and Europeans, to a large extent, didn't even keep track of how much money they sent to Ukraine from the beginning. That's why, at the time, there were all those back and forths with Trump shouting, we shelled out $400 billion. Macron would reply, no, actually, 200 billion. Back and forths over sums of money that no one can really pin down. But we're not talking about 100 or 200 euros or $200. We're talking about 400, 100 or $300 billion handed out with no accounting whatsoever, deliberately. Because that way, not only can the Ukrainians do business, but also the American arms companies, the American politicians, and likewise the Europeans. Come on, let's not forget.
Our dear and esteemed President of the European Commission, von der Leyen, already has experience with this. I was going to say I don't know why, I was going to say von der Felsen, but no, I mean, she already has experience in this business of grabbing things.
Aquí ella me está llamando por aquí por el auricular.
Here she's calling me through the earpiece. A message not just for you, Fernando, and for me, but also for the world. This assumption about the peace plan and Europe's position. She's really furious, to the point of delirium over this. 1 second. This way. She looks sad.
Por aquí.
Se la ve triste.
Sí, sí. Y leyendo también ahí, leyendo de un...
Yes, yes, and reading from the teleprompter too. This is his message.
Sustainable peace plan should first and foremost
Un segundito, quiero presentarlo con...
Just a second. I want to present it with the perfect version here. With the transcription. A bit lower. There we go. Good. Ukraine has been at the center of numerous debates in recent days. Any credible and sustainable peace plan must, above all, stop the killings and end the war without sowing the seeds of a future conflict. We have agreed on the main elements necessary for a just and lasting peace and for Ukraine's sovereignty. Let me highlight 3 of them. Attention. First, borders cannot be changed by force. Second, as a sovereign nation, no limitations can be imposed on Ukraine's armed forces that would leave the country vulnerable to future attacks and therefore also undermine European security.
Y por lo tanto también socavarían la seguridad europea. En tercer lugar, debe reflejarse...
Thirdly, the central role of the European Union in ensuring peace in Ukraine must be fully reflected. Ukraine must have the freedom and sovereign right to choose its own destiny. It has chosen a European destiny. It begins with the reconstruction of the country, its integration into the single market and our defense industrial base, and ultimately, accession to our union. We will continue working alongside Ukraine, our member states in the coalition of the willing, and the United States to achieve real progress toward peace. What matters is that we move forward. Well, I can't take any more of this nonsense, but specifically, Fernando, the main points of the plan: neutrality regarding NATO, demilitarization and the granting of territories, were all rejected.
Everyone? Well, that's what Trump wants. Of course. Someone said, I don't remember who, some European or something like that, or that woman. They said, no, demilitarization. Putin was generously saying 85,000. They say demilitarization, 800,000. But that's more than they have now. What kind of demilitarization is that?
Yes, 600 in the plan, but the same 600,000, if I remember correctly.
Or 600,000, I don't care if they don't have them. I mean, what a demilitarization. It's absurd. I can't resist mentioning one of my favorite politicians in Europe, someone who has a lot to do with this, who has been key. It's a shame he's not returning to the political arena with strength. I'm not saying to end up somewhere in Europe one day, but I'm referring to Boris Johnson, who said about this plan, I'm reading literally, that it's a complete betrayal and a military castration. Brilliant. This man said, this is a complete betrayal of Ukraine. This is Munich, declared Boris Johnson, referring to the 1938 agreement, and so on. Saying, this is Munich, Boris Johnson said, you can't, and he said, no, that you can't give in.
In Munich, if I remember correctly, Chamberlain took part at the time. Yes, of course.
But what wickedness. What wickedness. The good thing about Boris Johnson is that he doesn't care about anything. History. The most obvious evidence. It's just wickedness. I mean, well, that's it. Saying, well, whatever. I mean, come on. All the Europeans are already in panic mode. MERS has said it's suspending its entire agenda and is trying to figure out how to fix this. I mean, the Europeans are in no way concerned about managing a continent that's sinking faster than the Titanic, but they are worried about figuring out how to save Ukraine from the mess.
Here, more statements, Fernando.
This is a personal friend of yours. Attention. In a meeting convened by the President of the European Council, Antonio Costa, to analyze the collective response to the proposal made to Ukraine by the United States to end Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We agreed, as everyone knows, we made a joint statement on the value of the plan because it stands for peace, and in that you will always find Europe, Ukraine, and Spain. We have always maintained that it was not Europe, it was not Ukraine that said no to peace. On the contrary, it was others, in this case Spain. Putin's Russia, which has chosen war, has been invading an independent, sovereign country for more than 4 years, challenging its territorial integrity and violating its borders by force. And as we have repeated on many other occasions, for peace to endure, for it to be just, and to preserve the principles of the United Nations Charter, which are being violated by President Putin, including the principle of territorial integrity and the sovereignty of states, we obviously need to review this proposal in depth. It must take into account the interests of Ukraine and Europe, as it touches on issues that directly affect the future of our continent and, of course, also European security.
But you've got some nerve. Seriously, the nerve you've got is just starting to...
But immediate review. Immediate review.
But look, I mean, it's just unbelievable. We keep saying Pedro Sanchez and this whole bunch of Arsemius, they keep saying no, that they're not taking part in the war. Well, if you're not taking part in the war, you don't matter. You have nothing to say. But it affects Europe, it's Europe and all that. You're admitting you're involved, of course. That's one thing. And then the guy says, well, of course, Putin is bad, really bad. Fine by me, Putin is bad. As bad as you want, but he's winning the war. That's what you're telling us. Unbelievable. And then, what else did he say? Let's see, from what he came out with. He said something. I'm losing my train of thought. What else?
Come on. It seemed to me that Ukraine is always for peace and that Russia is the one responsible for this war. And that's why it's necessary. Then, basically reading between the lines, for Russia to surrender. In reality, that's their argument. We want peace. And then, oh well, so do they abandon their support for the war? No. We want peace through Russia's surrender. Let's keep hammering away at the war until Russia surrenders, and that will bring peace.
Wait, can you play the video again for a moment?
And I stop it right at that moment because I lose my train of thought. Part of the United States to put an end to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We have agreed, as everyone knows, we made a joint statement on the value of the plan because it stands for peace, and in that you will always find Europe, Ukraine, and of course Spain. We have always maintained that it was certainly not Europe that said no to peace. On the contrary, it was others. In this case, Putin's Russia, that chose war, invading for more than 4 years an independent, sovereign country, undermining its territorial integrity and violating its borders by force. And as we have repeated on many other occasions, for that too,
I know what it is. I just remembered. At one point he goes and says, because we support the enforcement of international law. Excuse me, but you're against international law and in favor of the rules-based international order. What are you talking about? So now it turns out that sure, when it suits me, I want international law. But in every other case, it's the rules-based international order, which really means the international order based on whatever I feel like. These people's speeches are just delusional.
Now, Fernando, this would make more sense if Europe were to reject this plan and, outraged, make a call for Europe's participation based on a position of strength. Given Europe's power, our demand would be, we want to take part in the negotiations, and we want to decide on this issue that is so important to us. Even if we don't participate directly, we still determine it through our power. Now, what can Europe do against Russia at this point? After 19 sanction packages that have had worse effects on Europe than on Russia, the uncontrolled sending of weapons and money, and yet with Ukraine practically disappearing as a state. What can Europe do in all this, Fernando, now?
¿Qué puede Europa en todo esto, Fernando, ahora?
Nada, cero. Es decir, Europa es un continente relevante.
Nothing. Zero. That is to say, Europe is an irrelevant continent. It already was some time ago, and it's becoming even more so. And on top of that, it's a ruined continent. So now they can't even send money. That's why they're trying to see if they can steal what they've seized from the Russians and figure out how to make part of that money go toward financing Ukraine. Because there's no money left to finance Ukraine. They've spent it all. In other words, these monumental rearmament packages are, to a large extent, fictitious. Militarily speaking, Europe is a complete zero. It's useless, totally useless. That is to say, politically it means nothing, economically it means nothing. Europe is done for, finished, kaput. This isn't going anywhere. And besides, since they're aware that they don't matter, they're cowards. Because if they actually had military, political, diplomatic, or economic power, then they'd say, no, if we have to go, we'll go, and we'll make a commitment to Ukraine and send troops. And that would mean war with Russia, but they're not going to do it. We've already heard it over and over again. They constantly hide behind the excuse that, well, yes, we'll send troops, as long as the Americans come with us, hand in hand, and support us. Because if not, we're not going, because we're scared to death. So what do we have? Leaders who, besides being inept and incompetent, are cowards. They throw the stone and hide their hand. In other words, these are our leaders, a bunch of shameless cowards. And that's why they're not willing to do anything except conspire. These are the real conspiracy theorists. Look, I was reading here. Friedrich Merz has canceled all his scheduled meetings to hold phone conversations with Trump, Zelensky, other Europeans, and so on. I don't know what. Conspiracies to see what they can do, to try to drag the Americans into the war no matter what. They don't know what else to do. Steinmeier, what's Steinmeier going to do? The country is like it's still in the 19th century.
Impoverished. These geniuses, Fernando, have already come up with a counterproposal. They've already presented a counterproposal. Not Sanchez, because they don't even let him take part in this.
No, Sanchez, no. He plays in the second division.
The G3, Merz, Germany, Starmer, United Kingdom, and Macron, France. This is the text, according to Reuters, the full text of the European counterproposal to the United States peace plan for Ukraine.
Now comes the laughter.
Yes, pre-recorded laughter in the background. We need to add text, yes. Number 1, Ukraine's sovereignty must be reaffirmed. Number 2, will a total and complete non-aggression agreement be reached between Russia, Ukraine and NATO? Will all the ambiguities of the last 30 years be resolved? In what way? Well, here they even remove point 3 of the US plan, a sort of correction to the American plan, even calling for the elimination of parts of the United States plan. Well, 4. After the signing of a peace agreement, a dialogue between Russia and NATO will be convened to address all security concerns and create an atmosphere of détente that ensures global security and increases opportunities for connectivity and economic growth. Thus, this peace agreement would first establish a ceasefire and then any discussion about Ukraine's membership in NATO. Only after that, eventually. Otherwise, no. 5. Ukraine will receive solid security guarantees. 6. The size of the Ukrainian army will be limited to 800,000 men in peacetime. Hence, the earlier confusion between 600,000 and 800,000. 600,000 in Trump's plan and 800,000 in this one. 800,000 in this one.
What are they saying?
These lunatics. Ukraine's accession to NATO depends on the consensus of its members, which doesn't exist. NATO agrees not to permanently station troops under its command in Ukraine during peacetime. That is, NATO agrees not to station troops, but only as its own decision. And Ukraine's membership is determined by them, so Ukraine and NATO, they decide that, for now in peacetime, whenever they want, they won't deploy troops. Therefore, Ukraine, NATO, Fernando, the reason for the war, and the main point of our agreement, they reject it.
Claro, pues si es que, bueno, impresentable, quiero decir.
Sure, but I mean, well, disgraceful, really. But look, what they're saying is outrageous. I mean, I'll decide when they join NATO or not. Now, I've got a few troublemakers like Viktor Orban and Robert Fico who've said no, that these guys won't join NATO even drunk. But fine, we'll just bypass their veto, right, and find some way to make it happen by simple majority or something like that.
Number 9. NATO fighter jets will be stationed in Poland. Number 10. US guarantee to Ukraine, obviously, reflecting Article 5.
Pay attention. The U.S. guarantee reflects Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, NATO's treaty. That is the one in which all member countries commit to coming to the aid of a country under attack. The type of aid isn't specified, it's understood to be military, but it doesn't have to be. Well, here these jokers are saying that for Ukraine, which isn't in NATO, the United States commits to applying Article 5 as if it were. What are they saying? Come on, what are these people smoking? What drugs are they on?
Esta gente que fuma, ¿qué drogas se meten? Ayahuasca, peyote, no sé.
Ayahuasca, peyote. I don't know. I mean, you're delusional, you're tripping. I mean, right now in the White House, they must be dying of laughter. But to such an extent, seriously. I mean, really, what are they trying to do with this? It makes no sense. I mean, do they really think this is a serious starting position for a negotiation with the United States? Not with Russia. With the United States, of course not. I mean, on Wednesday, Trump is going to say, look, this is your proposal. Well, I'll wipe my ass with your proposal. Just like that.
Trump's proposal to formally reject Ukraine's entry into NATO will be determined by the NATO member states themselves. For now, Hungary rejects it, but that may change in the future. Secondly, beyond the question of membership, the United States is established as a guarantor based on NATO's Article 5 on collective defense, which reaffirms all the reasons why Russia started this war in the first place. They enact the agreement, but even from their own perspective, it no longer makes total or absolute sense. A few more points.
Go on.
This is very amusing. A US guarantee that reflects Article 5. Ukraine is eligible for membership in the European Union and will gain preferential access to the European market in the short term, while this is being evaluated. A solid global redevelopment package for Ukraine that includes, well, a development fund for Ukraine. Business. Number 13. Russia will be progressively reintegrated into the global economy. Sanctions relief will be discussed and agreed upon in phases and on a case-by-case basis, not even with sanctions fully lifted. No, discussion of sanctions.
Notice that the previous one says, Russia will progressively reintegrate into the world economy. But it's already part of the world economy. The only ones it doesn't engage with are the Europeans, who are the minority.
It would be the Cherokees. Here, yes, but here's the reason why Russia is going to validate this. Putin is tempted by it. Russia will be invited back to the G8.
Man, come on. You see, the G8, the G7, it doesn't matter anymore. Trump himself laughs at the G7 and says, this is useless, I have to go because I have to go, but why would I meet with my vassals if I already talk to them often? Why would I go every now and then to meet there with the other 6? But it's laughable. Trump in his first term, I remember this, at one point with that chatty tongue of his said, why the hell would I go to the G7 if it doesn't matter in the world? They're nobodies. I meet with the Chinese, with the Russians, with the people who matter. But with these guys, he said it, you know? It's recorded somewhere. Why with these guys if they're nobodies?
Here's something else, Fernando. A working group will be established. Sorry, number 14. Ukraine will be completely rebuilt and financially compensated, including through Russian sovereign assets that will remain frozen until Russia. They want the theft of that money.
The theft, whatever it takes, look.
Whatever. A joint security task force will be established with the participation of the United States, Ukraine, Russia, and the Europeans to promote and enforce all the provisions of this agreement. Russia will enshrine in law a policy of non-aggression toward Europe and Ukraine. The United States and Russia agree to extend the non-proliferation and nuclear control treaties, including First START. Ukraine agrees to remain a non-nuclear state. As if it could do otherwise, right? As if it could do otherwise. Oh no, if they wanted to, they could start developing nuclear weapons tomorrow.
Well, then let them begin.
The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant will resume operations under IAEA supervision, and the energy produced will be shared equally, in equal parts. Ukraine will adopt the European Union's standards on religious tolerance and the protection of linguistic minorities, and from here, the territories. A long section in Trump's proposal, and here all of that is simply reduced to: Ukraine commits not to recover its sovereign territory occupied by military means. Negotiations on territorial exchanges will begin from the line of contact. All the measures included in Trump's plan regarding the de facto recognition of Crimea, Luhansk, Donetsk, the territories already captured in Kherson and Zaporizhzhia, everything established about Ukraine's withdrawal from the rest of Donetsk, all of that disappears. Because according to this, Ukraine will now reconquer its territory by non-military means. Something like, under the agreement, the Russians will kindly hand it back. Logical. Russia will not obstruct Ukraine's use of the Dnipro River. Ukraine will hold elections as soon as possible. Trump's proposal set 100 days for the elections, something concrete. Ukraine will hold elections as soon as possible after the signing of a peace agreement. Measures will be adopted to address the suffering of the victims of the conflict. This agreement will be legally binding. After the agreement, the ceasefire will take effect immediately after both parties withdraw to the agreed points for the start of the agreement's implementation. I haven't put the points here at any time. In the other one, yes. The terms of the ceasefire will be agreed upon by both parties under the supervision of the United States. Well, this is a bit of a comedy, isn't it?
Of course not. This makes no sense. It's a joke, a bad joke, and, well, an absolutely desperate attempt by the Europeans to try to prolong the war in Ukraine by any means, because they see that, with this move by Trump, the end of the war in Ukraine will speed up, which is exactly what they don't want. And so, well, they come up with these kinds of absurd proposals that no one is going to take seriously, absolutely no one. In fact, I think it was the Financial Times, if I'm not mistaken, that reported, more or less, that off the record, U.S. officials had spoken with European officials, high-ranking ones, and told them something. They told them, and I'm reading here indeed from the Financial Times, that the Americans informed European officials that their plan, the American one, is hardly open to discussion. So what the Europeans have said is basically a no. That is, General Driscoll, who seems to be the one replacing Kellogg, and who will now be in charge of dealing with these people, with the Ukrainians and so on, warned that Washington will show minimal flexibility and will not negotiate the details. I don't know, they're making it clear, but these people are still living in another world, another galaxy. No, now we'll launch this, See if it sticks. See if Trump's in a good mood one day. And I don't know, and no, really, it's just so delusional. I mean, these people don't even have the slightest capacity, not even strategic, but tactical from a political standpoint to, well, stall for time, gain some time at least. But with a proposal that might, let's say, make them think or slow down the implementation of Trump's points. No, they're incapable. I mean, really, they just can't do any better. They're that thick. But anyway, in any case, as I said, Trump did this precisely so that these disgraceful people would say no, which is exactly what we're seeing. They're rejecting Trump's 28 points, both the Ukrainians and the Europeans. And no matter how much Sanchez says that we welcome this peace proposal and all that, it's pure rhetoric. I mean, he has no choice but to say that, but they're all upset now. Really upset because they don't know how to get out of the mess, since Trump has taken a hard line. And now let's see how they manage to convince him to make another U-turn. Well, they're not going to be the ones to convince him. The only option they have is that within the chaos that is the Trump administration, where there's a bit of everything, the warmongering faction whispers in Trump's ear and says, hey, you know, this is too much. Maybe give the Europeans a bit of a break or something. Or grant them more extensions instead of the Wednesday ultimatum. Maybe give them another week or a month. Something like that. That's about it, really. In any case, as I said, this is a proposal made not to be fulfilled, meaning it's meant to be rejected. And that's why we've seen the Europeans desperate, and Zelensky, whom we just saw a moment ago, giving a speech where he's not exactly moved to tears either. That is saying, well, but knowing that he's going to have to tell Trump no. Let's see how he says it in such a way that Trump doesn't get terribly angry and crush them. I mean, look, he's not going to pull them out just like that, no, because this really is Trump's rhetoric, since it's not in his interest to do so. It's a negotiating card for Trump. No, he's not going to say, well, now I'm taking away all your weapons and all your intelligence. No, he hasn't done that. He said it before the summer, and he didn't do it. He made a show of it, but he's not going to do it. Why? Because it's a way to put pressure on Putin. Let's not forget one thing. One thing is that damn Macron, my goodness.
The one who doesn't know how to place a map. Here, Fernando, Macron's words, in summary. The agreement is positive. It's positive in the sense that it proposes peace and acknowledges important elements regarding sovereignty, security guarantees, and others. But it's a working basis that needs to be reconsidered. There are many things that can't simply be an American proposal. A broader consultation is required. That's why, starting tomorrow morning, the US negotiators will arrive in Geneva. The Ukrainian negotiating team will go there, and the European Union negotiating team, Germany, the United Kingdom, and France, will also go there to bring the substantial issues back to the table. I reiterate the willingness to hold talks, but only after a substantial discussion of the conditions. And by the way, regarding this meeting, Macron mentioned, right after the first session, the US representative Marco Rubio and Yermak, Zelensky's right-hand man, stated, at least based on what we've seen so far, that the Europeans did not take part. How could they participate if they weren't invited? The Ukrainians were there, but according to Macron, yes, tomorrow we're going to hold. But Macron made that up. The meeting, in fact, took place without the Europeans, and that's what they said right there, as they were leaving. Well, we had a great day. The two flags were there, the Ukrainian and the American. Nothing from the European Union.
Hay las dos banderas, por eso la ucraniana y la estadounidense, de la Unión Europea nada. En Ginebra tuvimos un gran día, hicimos muchísimos progresos.
In Geneva, we had a great day. We made a lot of progress.
2 weeks ago with a foundational document that we socialized.
Sorry for keeping you waiting. We started working 3 weeks ago with a document we distributed.
Repartimos.
ran by both sides and with input from both sides. And one of
And we delivered that document to both parties.
the lines and the important issues are for both sides.
Y cuando negocias con ambas partes, entonces siempre tienes una...
And when you negotiate with both sides, you always get a good sense of what each one's priorities are.
And so that allowed us to create a foundational document, which has been an ongoing...
Y gracias a eso, al diálogo con las dos
And
partes,
thanks to that, to the dialogue with both sides, we were able to create a foundational document for all of this. In fact, over the past 96 hours or more, there has been an intense exchange with the Ukrainian side, including our Secretary of the Navy and others.
Secretary of the Army and others.
Y este es el primer documento y es un documento de trabajo.
And this is the first document, a working paper. Over the past 96 hours, we have also been working intensively with the Ukrainian authorities. So far, our negotiators have been in Ukraine, meeting with lawmakers and members of the President's cabinet to smooth out the differences between the various parties.
Para, bueno, limar las diferencias entre las distintas partes, hoy llegamos aquí con un objetivo.
Today we arrived here with a purpose.
And try to narrow the ones that were open items. And we have
Nuestro objetivo de hoy era trabajar sobre los 28.
Our goal today was to work on the 28 or 26 points, depending on the version, and to narrow the differences on the issues that are still open. We've made a lot of progress. Naturally, this will ultimately have to be approved by the presidents.
Issues
that we need to continue to work on, but I think the report today is that I think today was worthwhile.
Well, the balance is very positive. It's been possibly the most productive conversation we've had. But there's still work ahead. This is a work in progress. That's why I don't want to declare victory yet. There's work to be done. But we're much further along than when we started this morning.
Mucho más adelante que cuando comenzamos esta mañana. Bueno.
Well,
lo que le toca decir, es decir, no, ha habido progresos,
What he has to say, I mean, no. For me, that's why we're making progress. But anyway, there's still a long way to go, right? What I've been saying, that this is just another way for Trump to buy time and for Putin to cover up illicit dealings. And meanwhile, Trump is surely calling Putin and saying, hurry up and crush the Ukrainians. They've kept you tied up in these pointless negotiations that lead nowhere. In other words, hurry up and finish destroying them already. Basically, I mean, yes, it's all a farce. As we said, let's suppose that all 28 points, both Ukrainian and Russian, are accepted just like that. Well, that's quite an assumption, huh?
Vamos, que ya suponer, hay que tener fantasía y imaginación. Pero bueno,
you really need to have a lot of imagination and fantasy. But fine, let's suppose they accept them. Okay, sure. But of course, these points, as we've read them, are completely ambiguous. They could mean anything. I mean, then this would have to be formalized in a treaty. Well, not necessarily a treaty, but in a document that could be signed. It doesn't have to be a treaty, but something that could be signed. And that's when you have to get into the details, and that takes months, if not years. I mean, depending on how, because they'll argue over every comma, just like they do in all documents. What they've presented is a document full of generalities that leads nowhere, and that later has to be turned into specific practical points.
Yes, Fernando, in your initial analysis, you emphasized the importance of time. And that's extremely important, because they can deliberate for a long time on these issues, including one about nuclear agreements. A long issue for the long haul. And in the meantime, Russia keeps making more advances and leaving more gaps.
Pero fíjate además que el negociador principal ha sido Yermak.
But look, moreover, the main negotiator has been Yermak, who's on the edge, and whose head they're calling for in Ukraine. How serious is this? Yes, possibly, or it's likely that they'll get rid of him. So whatever happens with Yermak doesn't matter. This whole thing is nonsense that can only be explained from this point of view. That is, from the perspective that the United States has decided to keep up the pressure giving Putin time to crush the Ukrainians and force them to accept Putin's terms, because there's no other option. That's it, because they're winning, and whoever wins sets the terms. You can present and dress it up however you like.
The map, the war as a context regarding why time is important, because each additional day without an agreement gives Russia a stronger position, and the opposite for Ukraine, for Europe, and for the United States as well. But anyway, here we are witnessing the management.
From the defeat by the United States, the management of that defeat, abandoning its role as mediator. Indeed, this is the big deal. Of course, Putin supported the grand agreement between Putin and Trump regarding the war in Ukraine. Don't worry, we'll roll out the red carpet for you to leave, and we'll even nominate Trump for the Nobel Prize in Russia. That's it. You've gotten rid of the burden, the one Biden left you with. Let's not forget that every time he speaks, when they presented those 28 points again, which he keeps repeating, Trump reminded us once more that this was Biden's war, that if he hadn't been president, it wouldn't have happened. We already know it by heart. And the dead, which is a terrible thing.
The agreement, summarized in 2 sentences, is as follows. You American guys can leave this war in which you clearly appear defeated, but you can leave it as peace mediators and not as losers. And, on the other side, in exchange, you effectively withdraw from the war, and as the winner, right? As an honorable exit for the United States, and Russia, in any case, winning.
And who are the losers? Ukrainians, Europeans. Always. The fools who always take the hits, And that's what's going to happen. Let's go. Because there have already been advances on all sides. Every day there are advances. This is already going from the north, and we end up in the south, which is the jewel of the crown. Let's start from the north. So we start with Borchin. In Sumy, there's no movement, so it's not very interesting. And here, as I said, if you look at the map, they're already advancing here. That is, here they're already pushing, as they do. This here is there, see it? A white area in the middle. That's what's left of the urban zone. There's nothing left of Borchan. And now what they're focusing on is rather starting to move forward beyond Borchan. That is, we're going to start advancing, because this is already settled. You could say Borchan is done. In other words, it no longer offers the Ukrainians any advantage. Well, they have nothing left to do there. From there, we're moving on. As I said, they're starting with the last small village, one of those hamlets they've taken quite a stretch of, I think along a road.
Hold on, let me check it too, I'm half blind. Let's see, speaking of views and reviews, Fernando. Look, I'm going through the likes, the thumbs up, and we've got 2,700 amazing people connected right now, on our way to 3,000, going up, and only 1,400 likes, dear Fernando. Folks, remember that this helps us fight censorship, and it also supports our work and rewards all our effort. Plus, it boosts the reach of all this, and therefore we appear less censorable, less demonetizable, than under constant censorship. And our effort isn't just, let's say, intellectual or academic or whatever. No. Our effort is basically to keep from being thrown in jail at this point.
That is to say, well,
with a judicial investigation started, right? And not finished. But anyway, I was fired from the university, censored in public media. Juan Antonio, with his own share of issues, now with his bank accounts also frozen. Well, that's the reality.
The freedom of European liberal democracy.
Yes, we take all this with humor, but it's a level of retaliation we've all suffered. So demolishers, help us out with a simple click on like, on the little thumbs up, please, dear demolishers. Well, that said.
Bueno, dicho esto.
Bueno, pues como decíamos, están en Bolsenia.
Well, as we were saying in Bolchan, they're already starting to move toward the outskirts of the city and take small towns, mainly to advance along the highway. In other words, because those are the logical routes of advance. And there's a highway that if we follow it from Bolchan, I'll tell you which one in a moment.
Let's see if I can get it here. This one here, almost sure.
Yes, that one. The one that takes you to Bilokarakin or something like that. I mean, this one is key because it structures all the logistics. Then to Aprikotne or something like that. All the logistics of the northern area of Kharkiv are organized through this road. A road that the Russians are going to end up cutting off. Because this northern part of Kharkiv, I more or less predict, I'll take a stand. If I'm wrong later, I'm wrong. But you can't do what the commentators on mainstream TV do. Those who say, well, war is very complicated, and it's very hard to make predictions because we live in a world of great uncertainty. Damn, anyone could say that kind of nonsense. That is to say, no, I'll take the risk. If I'm wrong, well, then I was wrong. Practically, this entire northern area north of Kharkiv is going to fall into Russian hands by the end of winter. I'm saying the end of winter, so late March, early April, when winter more or less ends. This is because there's no defense here, not many troops, and they no longer have reserves. So this whole area that goes from Bolchan to, look, this road that reaches this Prokholovne, and then from Prokholovne another one goes down that leads directly toward Kupiansk. Kupiansk is already occupied by the Russians. But anyway, this whole area is going to fall into Russian hands. The proof is that kind of L we have in the Kharkiv Oblast. The famous L that started with a small advance, and then little by little, they kept moving forward until they joined up and formed that L. Well, that's it. Every week they make a small advance and are waiting to strike when they think the time is right. They'll finish up with Kupiansk first, meaning they'll close the Kupiansk matter. But as soon as they do, the next target will be this northern part. I mean that once they finish cleaning up here in Kupiansk, and it's practically occupied. I mean, there are only 4 streets left, both in the, well, not in the eastern part. In the western part, it's completely occupied. In the eastern part, there's very little left. Well, once they finish this and move south and close off, I mean, eliminate this Kupiansk pocket, the next step clearly is this one. That is to occupy this northern part, in this sector.
All right.
And this is what we're going to see. As I said, Kupiansk is already exactly, that is, that sector over there, that corner. Just so we understand each other, that corner that forms the border between Russia and Ukraine, that's the next step. Because with that, they also put a lot more pressure on Kharkiv, the capital, the city. Although it doesn't even cross their minds to take Kharkiv, which, let's not forget, is the second most important and most populated city in Ukraine. But they're putting pressure on them and recovering an important part of Kharkiv that they once held. From here on, as I said, once this Kupiansk pocket that remains here is eliminated, the next step will be that one. As for those in Kupiansk, well, the Ukrainians are there carrying out counterattacks, generally, with the best possible outcome, achieving a tactical success of retaking a small area that shortly after, the Russians recapture again. And well, they're in an increasingly desperate situation, with the battalions inside this pocket, if I can already call it a pocket, given that the Oskil River serves as a natural barrier. So from here on,
yes, further down in the Oskil River.
There has been progress. This was an area that was more or less without major Russian movements, and they have advanced. We can see it there, those kinds of tongues we see here, moving toward the Oskil. That is the same one that's in Kupiansk, but then here it turns west. So, well, the idea, what the Russians want, and they're going to achieve it, is that everything east of the Oskil will be in Russian hands. The basic idea here is, from this area we see there, from the Russian zone of Novoplatnivka and so on, to finish conquering Borova. This is the key area here. They have now advanced toward the Oskil. As I said, this is a movement. There it is in gray, well actually red. And the key is to advance toward a city also used for logistics, logically, which is a little further south, called Borova. That is to the southwest. That's the key. And all of this is because by taking this area, the entire region falls, this whole zone, and therefore everything east of the Oskil will end up in Russian hands, both in the Kharkiv Oblast and in Donetsk. In other words, all of this will pass into Russian hands this winter. And then we move from here to Lyman, where progress has also been made. Very interesting progress. Finally, Stavki, which had been partially taken, then retaken a bit by the Ukrainians, then taken again by the Russians. Well, it has now definitively fallen into Russian hands. And let's not forget, that is the last village, because it is a village, they have left. Moreover, finally, there has also been progress here, in this area of the forest. This advance is becoming more consolidated, and in Lyman, the Russian vanguard units are already fighting in the southeastern part, as we've said, so to speak. Lyman still has some way to go, but now what the Russians are doing is cutting off the roads coming from the south, because the one coming from the north is already cut off. In other words, the ones coming from the south, this one here, are the ones the Ukrainians are using. They're practically cutting it off. They've already cut the branch that goes towards Siversk and have cut it again, because another place that had been heavily contested, Yampol, or Yampil, has finally fallen. Also, Yampol is a long, narrow city, so it's been like, first they take the northern part, then the Russians advance toward the center, but the Ukrainians counterattack and take back the center of the city. That's how it's been for quite a while. Now it's been completely taken, and not only have they captured the city of Yampol, but they've also reached the road that connects to Siversk again, which means they've cut it off in 3 places. In other words, they're right next to the Donets River. Basically, the good old Don. Well, things are already very complicated here. Why? Because Platonivka has been taken by the Russians, and that means they're closing in again. In case there was any doubt, they're going to cut that same road again in the Platonivka area. But look at how Siversk is right now. The Russians already completely control the north, which was the key to being able to take Siversk. And that's not an issue. The north is taken. They're practically about to enter from the north. But look, there have been 2 very significant advances this week. The Russians have entered from the south and are already inside Siversk fighting, but they've also entered, and most importantly, from the east. And as you can see, there you can tell they already hold a good part of it. And they've kept going, and this is important because this is the 3rd, let's say, area of advance that's going to end up destroying Siversk. A small town called, well, still called, Zvanivka has already been completely taken, down there on the TO5113 road. In other words, this was the last Ukrainian stronghold before Siversk along that road. Well, now the Russians are going to advance along that road, they're right next to it, meaning that from there they'll link up with the southern part, but turning westward. So as Ezekiel points out, Siversk is in a very tough spot, meaning
He's got 3 newscasts left, so let's see. I mean, this A little lower, Fernando, a big step forward today toward Paceno.
Sí, efectivamente, una prolongación desde
Yes, indeed. An extension from this whole area. Here I go down all the way to Paceno. Let's see, it reaches Paceno. Yes, let's see, just a little bit below Zvanivka, right where you were just analyzing Zvanivka, a bit past Zvanivka already. Right, I know which one you mean, Paceno, exactly. Well, there's been an advance toward Paceno here that ultimately we'll see where it leads. They'll probably start advancing steadily now. Let's not forget that if we keep going east from here, we'll eventually reach Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. Once Siversk is taken, what the Russians will do is move westward, and by the end of winter they'll be at the gates of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. I don't think they'll try to storm them at first, but we'll see. It'll also depend on... It's a rural area, right?
Without resistance.
Fields, yes. Here there are small towns, small villages, that in principle shouldn't pose major problems, given the current state of the Ukrainian army and its shortage of men. That is, the defenses they can put up here. Well, right now the Russians should be able to overcome them without too much trouble. Okay, further down. Let's go further down. We're saying all this assuming the Ukrainian army stays as it is, meaning it doesn't deteriorate any more than it already has. It will deteriorate, but we're making conservative analyses. In other words, assuming they stay as they are, not that they get worse. What's going to happen then? Anyway, so further down we already have, and we're going, well, Kostiantynivka. In Kostiantynivka, they're still advancing. There have been interesting developments in two directions. The first is the final capture of Ivanopilia. Ivanopilia is now completely taken by the Russians, and in fact they're already starting to move forward. Ivanopilia is almost right next to Kostiantynivka. So, let's say that the Russian front advancing toward the city, or penetrating into the city, will expand with Ivanopilia, meaning that the entire southern area will soon be in view. The whole south, from this lake, from the reservoir up to the city, all of this will fall into Russian hands. And from there, the front of advance within the city of Kostiantynivka will expand. At the same time, this is important to highlight, although it was a small movement, in the reservoir, not in the eastern part of the reservoir, but in the western part, which had been relatively still for some time, the Russians have started advancing again. And they've advanced in two positions. One, along a road that's right here, next to the reservoir, on the western side. That's where they've started to move forward. Let me see if I can tell you which road.
The H20.
The H20, right? And then they're also making progress. They've made a small advance through the T0504, which is the other one next to it.
Possibly this one here.
That one over there, exactly. Well, this means they're starting to move there too, to do what they always do. Start encircling Kostiantynivka from the south, from the east, and from the west.
Fernando, my dear, breaking news. We're taking a break from the military analysis because of the newly released statements about what happened in Genoa between Yermak and Rubio.
He looks very run down, really run down.
Yes, really. Signal, besides the situation, must be pure headbutt against the table.
Little piece of advice, kids. You know, drugs are really bad.
Yes, a flower table. Let's present it that way, right? For the audience. In general, a flower table. Well, here are Zelensky's words. I wish you health. Today has been a day of numerous meetings and negotiations. Basically, since the morning we've had calls, briefings, and consultations. The Ukrainian delegation in Geneva has already held a series of meetings with both the US side and our European partners. The delegation has just reported on the results of their talks, which were substantial. A lot is changing. We are working very carefully on the necessary steps to end the war. Today, negotiations will continue in Switzerland, and the teams will work practically until night. We will receive their reports. It is important to have dialogue with the US representatives, and there are signs that President Trump's team is listening to us. I also spoke with the President of France, Macron, and with the Prime Ministers of Canada, Croatia, and Luxembourg. I just spoke with the German Chancellor, Scholz. I thank them all. There have also been many more messages. Everyone is offering support, sharing advice, providing information, and I want to thank each person. Whoever offers this help to us is offering it to all of Ukraine. It is important to ensure that the steps to end the war are effective and that everything is viable. Ukraine has never wanted this war, and we will never be an obstacle to peace. Diplomacy has been revitalized, and that is very good, very good. We hope the outcome will be the right one. The first priority is stable peace, guaranteed security, respect for our people, respect for all those who gave their lives defending Ukraine from Russian aggression. Tomorrow will be no less active. We defend Ukraine's interests. The strength of our position lies in the fact that it is a shared position. The unity of Ukrainians in defending our national interests, our independence, and our sovereignty is what makes the difference. There are guidelines for the Ukrainian delegation. Our delegation is following a Ukrainian course, and it is highly desirable that no contradictory signals come from Ukraine. This, of course, is in relation to the corruption scandal. I understand that intelligence services and partners report that the Russian position has begun to take shape, also through certain actors in Ukraine. This certainly does not help. We have our state position, we have our Ukrainian dignity, and we must act in a way that strengthens it, not weakens it. I hope those in charge of this are listening to me now. Having a Ukrainian passport means feeling responsible for Ukraine, and it's clear that millions of Ukrainians strongly support the state's position, our independence, and Ukraine's sovereignty. People must benefit from every political decision, and that's why we are working hard, with great seriousness and attention at every step, and with all our partners. Well, thanks to everyone around the world who supports Ukraine. Thanks to the United States, to the leaders of Europe. Glory to Ukraine.
What Estefan Bandera used to say, glory to Ukraine, Ukraine. But anyway,
Trump is listening to us, and it's important that a unified voice comes from Ukraine. This is for his investigators.
Look at what he said. I mean, since he's being harassed to a tremendous degree, he says something like, we have to stay united because we know the Russians are with Ukraine's enemies, basically with the internal enemies. In other words, he's suggesting that the pressure he's facing over the corruption issue from part of the regime, Poroshenko's faction and company, is the Russians doing and all that. And that now, therefore, everyone must unite because he's so harassed that you can see it. He looks worn out, in terrible shape, and it's becoming clear that he's in his final days because they're going to depose him. Exactly. I mean, they're going to remove him one way or another. Seriously, he looks haggard, in terrible shape, pitiful. He looks like he hasn't slept, like he's been abusing white powder, like someone who knows his days are numbered, very few left. This is like a death sentence. I mean, it's like the Nuremberg trials. Look, the verdict's already in, and it'll be carried out, I don't know, in 5 days. Well, he's got the same look on his face.
Very bad, very bad. Even considering his usual face, which isn't very healthy either, but...
Yeah, well, I called and all that, and look where he's doing it from. a blank wall. I mean, not even a halfway decent place. No, just anywhere. That is a place that isn't recognizable, a blank wall. And that's it, and there he's talking about it. Well, I mean, that's how it is. As our friend Waldo Quijada says, all of the West is falling apart, political corruption is global, no one is spared, including us South Americans. Greetings to Fernando Moragón and Ezequiel Bistoletti. Great work you're doing. Thank you very much. And indeed.
We're witnessing a collapse. Thanks also to Tonio9028 for his messages. I've been following DMP since it started. Thanks to this channel, I've discovered analysts like Juan Antonio Aguilar and Adrian Zelaya. Well, obviously Fernando too. But I discovered you, Ezequiel, on the show A Fondo and the beatings you gave the NAFOS there. Well, thank you very much, Tonio. Many people had their first contact with geopolitics through those A Fondo programs, until my expulsion and censorship. And how nice that everything said 3 years ago on that show came true, word for word. Well, despite the attacks, the caricatures, the parodies, and all the unpleasant moments behind the scenes on that show, we'll present them someday. But anyway, Fernando, let's start over a bit. Maybe we can speed up the analysis a little. Let's speed up.
Aceleremos. Prokrovsk, directamente. Prokrovsk está el asunto.
Prokrovsk, directly. Prokrovsk is on its last legs. But come on, this is nothing new. The entire south is taken. I mean, when I say the entire south, it's no longer just the positions that were out in the field and so on. As you know, this shape here shows that it has Minograd, which is like a core, a narrow area, and another core, while the southern core is completely taken by the Russians. There's nothing left. Only the northern core remains, and part of that northern core is also taken by the Russians. We're witnessing the end. It doesn't matter if it drags on for a week, 2, 3. There's nothing left to do here. They keep bombing with bombs. Today I saw one with glide bombs, and they're dropping the Fab 3000s, the 3-ton ones. Imagine how things must be there. This is over. There's nothing left. And in fact, what the Russians are already doing is preparing the assault toward Kostiantynivka. They've been advancing toward Kostiantynivka, and from there the next target is a town next to Pokrovsk, where not a single street is left. Without taking Pokrovsk, even the Ukrainians have admitted this. From there what we'll see is an advance toward Hryche, and when all this is over, an advance through Dashne, Molodetske, and Dnipropetrovsk toward Meshova, which will fall before winter ends, I'm telling you. Logistics hub, the one in Dnipropetrovsk, and from Meshova toward Pavlohrad, but we'll leave that for later. Also important in Novopavlivka. Novopavlivka has been taken, they advanced, first they took the south, then moved north, then stopped because there's a river in between. Afterward they crossed it and took the other area, and it's practically secured. So this whole area is going to fall soon because there's nothing left. And this was the major barrier they had here in Dnipropetrovsk, in this area. So once this area has fallen, they can move directly not only from the east but from Udashne and also from here to Meshova.
Here, images, Fernando, from today from the center of Pokrovsk with the Russian troops. Pay attention to this. We are in the center of Pokrovsk, where the Russian forces cleared out the Pokols, as they call them. We are at the maternity hospital. Today is November 23. There, the hospital. On one side and the other. What a thing, seeing the Soviet flag almost as often as the Russian flag among the soldiers.
No, but it makes sense. Look, it's not because they're communists or anything like that. It's just that when the Soviet Union disappeared, what remained by tradition were all the army flags from the Soviet era. So all the units have Soviet flags. Then when they arrive, they put up their unit's flag, which will have a sickle, a hammer, and things like that. But that's because they kept it. In other words, they didn't change it. not because they're communists or anything like that.
No porque sean comunistas ni nada por el estilo.
Sí, sí. Acá otro mensaje de Tonio.
Yes, yes. Here's another message from Tonio, from Fernando. Years ago, I came across some of his interviews, where the press always described him as a man from Moscow, the Muscovite. Too bad they didn't invite Fernando to the in-depth program on Deutsche Welle in Spanish as well. Well, that was recorded in Berlin, in Germany, so that's why they didn't call him.
My German is bad even in Spanish, but oh well. My German is basically Kartoffeln, which means potato, and not much more.
Many thanks once again to Tonio for the message. Thank you very much. Back to. According to the map, it's now closed, officially closed. This actually had never been closed. Yes, closed now.
From practice, but well, yeah.
And as we can see, already advancing toward Grizne. As I said, then from Udatne, as soon as they finished dealing with the Prokhorov issue, the advance from Udatne from the east and the advance from Novopalika from the south toward Mazoba, in no time, and Mazoba will fall. A very important logistical hub, and from there the road to Palograd. It's possible that by the end of winter we'll be with the Russians in Palograd. I think so. It's feasible.
Yo creo que sí. Es factible.
So I'll follow your path, Fernando. First, let's see there on your side.
Then comes Modo del Exque, which is taken, and there's a small one in Novo Pidro or something like that. It's just unpronounceable. They've taken part of it there. Well, they're on the TO406 road, which will take them directly to Mazoba.
All right, and from the south, and from Mazoba toward Pavlograd, located farther away. That's already done, but anyway, there.
But once Mazoba is taken, that's where they're heading. And right now, once Novopolika is taken, they're advancing toward Mazoba from the south.
Here down below too.
Indeed, from here they're going to take it from the east and from the south, and they'll wipe it out quickly. We keep moving down, and now we get to this interesting area where Berezho-Mikhailivka is located. There, Berezho-Mikhailivka, they'll take that in no time. And the last thing, well, the second to last, this place here, Tix-G, who knows how it's pronounced, was taken just today, along with the surrounding areas. At the same time, the capture of Hai has been consolidated. I'm not sure how that's pronounced either. And look, they're already right next to Prokhorov. Prokhorov will be next, and it's going to fall too, because the Russians are making a very interesting move. Notice that they're not only taking all these areas, moving in, so to speak, from the east toward Prokhorov. Prokhorovske, that's another one not to be confused with Prokhorov, though their names sound similar. What's with Ukrainians always using the same names? I mean, it's something else. Anyway, there's progress here. If we look at Dnipropetrovsk, which has advanced, and this is important, in several localities already, they've crossed the road connecting Pokrovsk with Huliai-Pole, and they've taken Neshvilivka, Radisne, and Novozaporizhia. Watch out, because they've already crossed the road and are taking over this whole area. Why? Because once they secure this zone, apart from Huliai-Pole to the south, from here they'll move north toward Pokrovsk. In other words, watch out, they're moving up toward Pokrovsk, because they're advancing very quickly.
So Fernando, to sum up here, Tix-G is between Berezho-Mikhailivka and Pokrovske, taken today with a very strong advance up to the river. Then here in their Hai.
Also, and further down, if you take the road, you'll notice there are 3 towns, Neshvilivka, Radisne, and Novozaporizhia, which have been taken by the Russians already on the other side of the road. They're already advancing on the other side. And while they're already in the city, everything that could be taken has been taken, including that place, I don't even want to pronounce it. It's got an S, an H, another S, another H. How do you even pronounce that? Anyway, that's been taken. Visok has been taken, and they're already at the gates. I mean, there's nothing left between the area conquered by the Russians and Huliaipol. Not even open fields. That is to say, in fact, it's already being said that there are some reconnaissance units inside Huliaipol. Huliaipol is going to fall quite quickly. Right now, the Ukrainians are acting desperately, but they don't have units. They're trying, having already lost Pokrovsk and Mirnorad, they're trying to redeploy some units to support Huliaipol, but I think it's already too late. Anyway, and here, therefore, this is going to be terrible, because once Huliaipol is taken, they'll go for Orikove, or Oriyeve, well, depending on how you pronounce it. But watch out, because in Orikove we were talking the other day about how they had advanced through Mala Tokmachka. Do you remember? This front. Well, they've opened another front. That is, today they've advanced toward Novodanilivka. Right? Over here? Ah, exactly. So now they're starting to apply pressure, waiting for Huliaipol to be taken. Boom! They'll come in from the east and from the north, hitting them from the rear, so they're going downhill fast, and that practically means the fall of Zaporizhia. No, look, imagine you're on a slope sliding downhill backward.
Special greetings to Fernando, who combines charm and knowledge, making this channel very entertaining.
Well, downhill and fast, yes, yes. Right, so this is also going to fall quite quickly once Huliaipol falls. And this means that except for the city of Zaporizhia, the capital of the Zaporizhia region, the rest is taken, or will be taken. And we're going to have, in the most conservative scenario, the Russians in Zaporizhia by the end of this winter. But well, by the end of this winter. And we've already talked about Dnipro. As for Kherson, it's going to stay there. The Russians will have it, let's say, on standby pause, depending on how events unfold. And they'll activate it whenever they want. We don't know that. And that will depend on the movement of Ukrainian troops. As the Ukrainians keep putting out fires, that is, trying to put out fires, I move from here to there. Now I'm already losing it because I'm going somewhere else because they're attacking me and I've got a huge hole. Well, they'll use it there also, as they do now, to pin down troops. But not even for that, because right now in Kherson, the Ukrainian units there are very few, about 2 or 3 battalions and a few companies. That's it. Well, as I said, they'll reactivate it when they think it's appropriate. But anyway, this winter, along with the attacks, let's not forget attacks that continue night after night. Some days are more brutal, but night after night, against the Ukrainian energy system, this means that defeat is inevitable. Even though they have a relatively mild winter, as I said, we were just seeing it now. It's autumn. Let's not forget that. In January, it'll be -10 in Kiev, so you can imagine. In fact, there are already small protests in some towns over power outages, because we're not talking about a 1-hour blackout. In some places, it's 14 or 16 hours without electricity. And the Russians keep bombing, so the situation keeps getting worse. That's why Zelensky is terrified, because from a military standpoint, this is a disaster, and politically they're after his head. And within Ukraine, from the political standpoint of the big godfather, the United States, it's the same. So it's not by miracle. In the coming days, we'll see him worn down to the bone, because he's got 2-3 days left. Almost nothing.
Maybe he's the bad guy with a little powdered gasoline, right? It reactivates him. When evil leaves the meetings for a bit, a quick trip to the bathroom, a few head movements like this, and he's back.
A psychiatrist friend of mine told me this a while ago, And she said, look, we know this. I mean, Spanish politicians from any side, especially when they're very active, like during election campaigns, they're full of drugs. And she showed me, see this one here? I don't remember the name, but they take this one. It was prescription. With this, you can handle anything. Let's not fool ourselves. Who really believes someone can get through 2 weeks of an election campaign practically without sleeping? They get through it with drugs. Let's not fool ourselves. And professionals know this. Anyway, that's how it is. And this happens in Spain, in Germany, in France, everywhere. Zelensky's case is a particularly serious one, but well, so that's how things are. That's the situation. And I don't know if we have, how are we doing on time?
No, it's starting now, Santiago.
And what about likes? How are we doing on likes?
De likes en este momento.
Likes-wise, right now we're at about 2,200, practically.
2,200 likes prácticamente. 2,500 demoledores.
2,500 demolishers now. At the best moment, 2,800. So well, you still have a few last minutes, a few last seconds to hit that like button like crazy. So please, go for it. This is essential.
Well, this is a decisive week, so very important. On Wednesday, our next talk.
On Wednesday, with the ultimatum.
Exactly. The ultimatum for Thanksgiving. Is Thanksgiving celebrated in Spain, Fernando?
No, not here, not here, not here. That thing about eating turkeys and all that, no. I mean, no, we already have enough with Halloween. I don't say Halloween, I say Halloween. I mean, I make it Spanish. They set it up as if it were a historic and traditional Spanish holiday. And man, it's just not. Here, November 1st was historically a day of reflection when people went to cemeteries to visit their dead. But no, now it's all about partying. But Thanksgiving, that's really too much. I've been told, though you probably know more about this, my Latin American friends and all, I've been told that in some countries where there's a strong evangelical church presence, Thanksgiving is celebrated through the evangelical church.
Very likely. Very likely. Now in Argentina, the peak of cultural imperialism can be seen in the celebration of St. Patrick's Day. Our St. Patrick. Of course, but not celebrated for St. Patrick himself, rather for the very popular Irish celebration of St. Patrick's Day. He's the patron saint of Ireland. So, in the downtown areas, in neighborhoods with lots of Irish pubs, they close off the streets, and people are drinking beer, dressed like Irish folks, in the best Irish tradition. We're always very eager to adopt foreign holidays, but when it comes to celebrating our own, folk music, tango, all that, oh no, what rubbish.
Now that you mention it, I've been out of touch for a while, but what you do see is the usual thing. The Irish pubs around here in Madrid celebrate St. Patrick's Day and throw some wild parties, and they're usually packed with Spaniards, because the Irish and the Spanish generally have one thing in common. We don't like the English all that much. Yeah, well, same with us. And we also share something else. We love beer. The Irish, you know, they really go for it.
Strong and harsh. Strong and harsh. Yes, no, I have nothing at all against St. Patrick's Day, far from it, but I do have something against that. And this happens in Argentina, in Latin America in general, but especially in Argentina, because of this stupidity of ours, mainly from Buenos Aires, from the people of Buenos Aires. This conviction that we are the Europe of Latin America, and that not only the rest of Latin America, but also the rest of Argentina outside Buenos Aires, are all those Indians, and we are the white ones. That pathetic, colonialist, horrible attitude of many of my compatriots. And that's why there's rejection of all the beautiful things in our culture, from the tango of Buenos Aires to the folklore of the different provinces, Latin American folklore, the brotherhood of all our brothers and sisters in Latin America. But no, St. Patrick's Day, well, it's part of our idiosyncrasy, unfortunately.
parte de nuestra idiosincrasia, lamentablemente.
Pero ¿cuál sería?
But what would the holiday be, aside from Christmas, New Year's, and so on? What would be the quintessential Argentine holiday? The one that's truly popular and widely celebrated?
No, bueno, las fiestas patrias, el 25 de mayo, la Revolución.
No, well, the national holidays, May 25th, the May Revolution, which marks the beginning of the road to independence, Independence Day. But then, for example, during Carnival, the celebrations take place with parades, something very specific to the Rio de la Plata region, with music and a type of dance unique to Carnival, derived from the celebrations of black slaves during colonial times. We share this music with Montevideo, and that's where the popular murgas come from. But the well-off, middle-class people grumble about it. Those dark-skinned folks there in the neighborhood parades, now they come into the cities, and on top of that, the city government blocks the streets so they can dance through them. Well, that's our thing. Not everyone's, luckily, not the rest of Argentina's. That very porteño attitude of the well-off, upper Buenos Aires middle class, with their European airs. Well, like Europe now, a mess. Yes, basically. Not even a reference point anymore, right?
Anyway, let them switch continents and say, we're Chinese or Asian, because this whole Europe thing doesn't sell anymore. Come on.
Let them change. Let them change their model. Because this one, I've seen it in Spain too, talking with somewhat snobbish Spaniards, as you call them, right? Yes. Yes, yes. Those flashes of submission to the empire too, right? Instead of celebrating what's their own and all the beautiful things about Spain, no. Their eyes are always set on, like, the United States too, right?
Look, cultural colonization is everywhere. I mean, especially in Europe, right? And in Spain in particular. Here, even the most anti-imperialist left-wing people drink Coca-Cola, wear jeans, which, let's not forget, is an American invention, and listen to music in English, I mean. Well, and they binge-watch series on Netflix. What can you do?
Yes, yes, yes.
We shouldn't reject contact with other cultures, but rather the rejection of our own culture. That, to me, that makes me really angry. But anyway, dear Fernando, come on. We'll be back here again on Wednesday. It's starting now.
There it is.
If it hasn't started already, Santiago Martinez is on our sister channel, MP Geopolitics. Please help us by subscribing to that channel, to our English channel, to TikTok, which we recently reactivated with shorts, and of course to this channel, as always. Dear Fernando, as always, a pleasure, a hug, and see you soon.
Likewise, see you later.